afternoon to you all. A great pleasure to be here today, speaking from Bahrain from a hotel room. So please excuse me for probably the light effects. But I thought I'll speak about a very important concept today, which has not yet taken roots in India. And that is about data and equity in isolation, and then data equity together. We all know that data is the new oil. Everybody has been talking about it. Today, there is also a call for policy to be data-driven and make optimal use of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and big data analytics just for the purpose of, better policy making. But for an Indian society, which is riddled with various sharp socio-economic and political inequities, the role of good data for effective and targeted policymaking cannot be overemphasized. Inaccurate data may only go on to exacerbate these inequities, and therefore the importance of good data. The best example of the data being collected properly and being utilized properly without any kind of corruption at any level is the way Orissa has managed the cyclones year after year, and sometimes many times during the year. And that has been possible due to accurate collection of data and analysis of such data as to where the landfall would be, just as we are experiencing today and tomorrow a cyclone of similar nature in Orissa. Exactly we know where the landfall is going to be, exactly we know what the wind speed is going to be, exactly we know when the reverse wind speed is going to be, and that's how data has helped in managing disasters and saving human lives. And that's the beauty of having good data. And that involves collection, analysis, communication, and management. The entire ecosystem of data involves these four aspects. For your information, this demand for data is required not just by leadership, legislators, media, and the public, but it is also required by governments for evidence-based policymaking. Now, the point is, however, when the data is not good, when the quality of data is not good, poor data, inaccurate model, it gives rise to inaccurate models, inaccurate forecasting, and poor policymaking, poor forecasting, poor targeting of beneficiaries. So the example, there are several examples during my entire career in the CAG's organization. I have seen how poor data collection has resulted in a well-designed public policy not being delivered, not being able to deliver the services that it was intended to the right kind of people. Let's say the absence of data that we had during the reverse migration. We had no data, and therefore the policy, we didn't have any policy, well-directed policy, targeted policy. Let's look at the second wave of the pandemic. There was a lag between the data that we are getting from the field and the model that we are forecasting. And the result is that the peaks were not getting forecast at the right point of time, and therefore the geographic specific kind of interventions which is possible through micro containment strategies was not getting done. It was getting sanitized over a period of time, getting better over a time, but however, at the point of time when this happened, we didn't have data. Now the point is, when we have such situation, the question that comes before us is that the poor data we have already seen in several cases in other places as well. For example, we have seen this in case of our GDP figures. The IMF has talked about our GDP figures, the deflators not being used properly or being used inaccurately, the consumption data not being reliable, the employment data not being available, the census data being suspect. Now, what happens in all this is not that the data purely from the point of view of policy is giving rise to inaccurate evidence-based policymaking, as we say, but it is actually exacerbating the inequities in several cases. For example, if the data of the new series that we followed in GDP, it showed that agriculture already had a growth which was probably not there. And therefore, the emphasis of the government on agriculture began to decline. And that's a worrisome, that created inequities. If the data would have indicated that the rural employment has actually improved over a period of time, then again, that is actually giving rise to the inequity. It is actually increasing and reinforcing the inequity, even though the intention of the government to use public policy for ameliorating the situation is there. So you can see that poor data results in a crisis. It results in inequities being created and in some cases perpetuated. And therefore, the reason that I have chosen the topic today, that data has a singular important role to play in removing inequities, in maintaining equity in society, in our economy, in our consumption patterns, in our labor, in our employment. Now, what is required to be done? The process is clean. The entire process of collection of data has to be very clean, very sanitized. And that starts at the panchayat, at the village, at the district, at the state, and the national level. Because the data is initially captured at the panchayat level. Unless the system is very robust at that particular stage, we actually have a problem in hand. Similarly, a task force for data quality governance has to be set up, which would coordinate with the state governments from where the data is getting collected in several cases. And that data architecture has to be standardized, and therefore we have good data coming from the system, and that would give rise to better policy, and as I said, better attacking the questions of inequities at various places in society. Therefore, what we need is a rich data culture, a complementary data ecosystem, and a data governance model that can be there, all pervading in all sectors and domains of society, of governance. And the result would be that we exactly know where the money has to be spent, where the effort has to be done, where the resources have to be deployed, and we would actually have better outcomes and more effective and efficient outcomes. Now, having talked about this, I come to a point which has not been talked about so far, I think, in our country, in our government systems. And that assumes importance because we are now currently talking about the Personal Data Protection Bill, of which there is a joint parliamentary committee in which I'm a member. We are talking about the non-personal data report, which has been set up by a committee set up by the government. So when we have government thinking about bringing in policy to manage this data, we have to think about data equity. And this data equity is a very broad concept. It has not been understood. It is little hazy. But data as a manifestation of knowledge can create power asymmetries. It is the uneven opportunities to access data and the harm from misuse of data upon disparaged communities that we have to watch out for. The NPD committee talks about open government data initiative, community data, and it delves into public and private rights that might subsist in such kind of data. And therefore, I think this is the most appropriate time when you and I, the whole country, has to think about data equity. And when I say why we need this data equity, we need it because it is important for political and practical connotations. It impacts people in various ways, both in the state and the private sector. There is data-driven discrimination in advance. Just as the technology progresses, data processing progresses, there could be actually data-driven discrimination. I'll give some examples when I come to the later points, that this discrimination can happen at the level of a gender, at level of a rural-urban divide, at the level of the poor and the rich, at the level of people who have access to health and people who do not have access to, let's say, better tertiary health care. Therefore, it is important to see how people are made visible, represented, and treated by their own data, because they are the data principals. They are the ones who share the data. And therefore, it is their rights, it is their equity that we have to be concerned about while talking about all this regime that we are setting up for their personal data protection and also non-personal data regime. So the laws that must be made for maintaining this data equity has to be taking care of four aspects. One is the representation equity. That is, it should be fairness to the people who are represented and treated. For example, we cannot have data which is classified just in a binary of a gender as male and female, because there are transgenders. Now, when we don't think about them, what kind of policy we will have for them, what kind of equity we can give to them. Then there is the question of access equity, which of course, as the name suggests, it is the opportunities for innovation and social, economic, and environmental problems that can be solved with access to data and the ability to use such data. But unfortunately, this data should not only be available with the big enterprises, it should be equally available to the people who are in the small scale sector, in the micro sector, because they should also be able to use that data for their growth and for giving service to society. We have also what is called as a feature equity. Feature equity is how to use different databases to arrive at, to make maximum use of it. The companies make use of it, different databases, different data tables, but can the person who is actually sharing his data is able to use that? So that those features should also be available to him. And then there is the most important, which is the outcome equity. The outcome equity is important because the unintended consequences have to be monitored and mitigated. It is not that when the data principle, you and I have already given our data, then nobody looks after us. The outcomes that happen due to utilization of our data is equally important to be shared with us, to be taken care by those people who are processing our data, as far as what kind of consequences that it causes to the data principles whose data have been taken. So in the end, I'd like to say that the idea of data equity integrates a myriad of approaches, disciplines, and concerns. It is an interplay between data and social justice. We know what happened in the Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, where data of people were used for political advocacy. The decision-making could be biased, leading to bigotry and ostracism of certain groups. It could lead to dehumanization of decision-making. Therefore, the interplay between data and equity has pushed the digital infrastructure to engage more categorically with questions of power and politics. And it is here that the concept of data equity assumes importance. We have to ensure that the trust between the data principles and the data processors, may it be government, may it be private, is maintained. And therefore, we need to think about data equity. We need to think about an ecosystem and an architecture that actually establishes the data equity in such a manner that it is a balanced structure that we have in hand. Thank you so much.